The ballroom glittered with a ferocity that hurt the eyes. Light, fractured by 1,000 crystal pendants, cascaded over silks and satins, turning the London season's elite into a shimmering, faceless sea. From her accustomed place near a potted fern, Lady Elara Ashworth watched the tide of humanity ebb and flow, a quiet island in its vibrant current. She was accustomed to this view, to the role of observer. It was her sister Seraphina who was born to swim in such waters, and swim she did. Seraphina was a vision sculpted from moonlight and ambition, her gown a confection of silver silk that clung to her form, her dark hair studded with diamonds that vied with the chandeliers. Every gesture was a calculated note in a symphony of allure, every laugh a carefully tuned bell designed to draw attention. Tonight, her focus, and indeed the focus of every eligible lady in the room, was singular. Alistair Vance, the Duke of Blackwood. He stood near the grand archway, a figure of stark, unyielding shadow against the room's effusive brilliance. He was impossibly tall, with shoulders that spoke of strength rather than tailoring, and a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite and displeasure. Jet black hair, severe and unadorned, framed features that were undeniably handsome, but utterly devoid of warmth. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, swept the room with an unnerving stillness, missing nothing and approving of less. He was the season's great prize, impossibly wealthy, powerful, and tragically widowed. The combination was an irresistible lure, a challenge that made mothers whisper and daughters blush. Elara watched Seraphina begin her campaign. A delicate fan, a strategically dropped handkerchief, a luminous smile aimed across the crowd. It was a flawless performance. Their family's future rested on its success. The Ashworth name was old, but the coffers were all but empty. A subtle decay had settled into their Mayfair townhouse, a scent of desperation beneath the beeswax polish. Seraphina's brilliant match was not merely a desire, it was a necessity. Elara, with her quiet disposition, her love of books over balls, and her face she privately considered merely serviceable, was not part of the equation. Her role was to be present, proper, and invisible. She smoothed the skirt of her own gown, a simple muslin in a shade of pale lavender that her mother had declared suitable for her complexion. It was a dress designed not to be noticed, and in it, Elara felt she had perfected the art of fading into the wallpaper. She found a strange comfort in it, this anonymity. It allowed her to see things others missed, the flicker of desperation in a young lord's eyes as he lost too much at the card table, the false camaraderie between two society matrons, the genuine, uninhibited joy of a young debutante tasting champagne for the first time. The Duke of Blackwood, she observed, was a master of stillness. He did not move through the crowd. He held his ground, and the crowd parted for him. He accepted greetings with a curt nod, his responses brief and final, discouraging further conversation. He looked bored, irritated, and utterly out of place, a hawk trapped in a cage of gilded canaries. Elara found herself wondering what could bring such a man to a place he so clearly despised. Duty, perhaps, or something more? There were whispers about him, of course, whispers of a great tragedy, of a heart locked away, of a first duchess who had been his entire world. The gossips said he had not been seen to smile since her passing 3 years ago. The orchestra swelled, the first notes of the opening waltz filling the air with a hopeful, romantic tremor. A collective intake of breath seemed to pass through the room. The first waltz was a declaration. Whomever the Duke of Blackwood chose would be the talk of the season, her future all but assured. Seraphina, positioned perfectly near the dance floor, tilted her head, her expression a perfect blend of demure invitation and supreme confidence. Elara's heart beat a little faster for her sister, a knot of hope and anxiety tightening in her chest. Their father's worried face, the lines of strain around his eyes, flashed in her mind. Then, the unthinkable happened. The Duke moved. He pushed away from the wall, his progress a silent, inexorable path through the glittering assembly. People stepped aside as if by instinct. His stormy eyes were fixed, not on the radiant Seraphina, not on any of the other dazzling beauties vying for his attention, but straight ahead. Straight towards the potted fern, straight towards Elara. She froze. Her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. It had to be a mistake. Perhaps he was heading for the refreshment table behind her. Perhaps he meant to speak to Lord Ashworth, who stood nearby. She tried to make herself smaller, to melt further into the shadows of the fern's fronds, her cheeks burning with a sudden unwelcome heat, but he did not stop. He came to a halt directly before her, the sheer height of him blocking out the rest of the ballroom. The scent of winter air and clean linen clung to him, a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes of the crowd. Up close, his face was even more severe, the lines around his mouth etched deep, his eyes holding a profound, impenetrable darkness. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, the music and chatter fading to a distant hum. "Lady Elara," he said. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of inflection, a statement of fact rather than a greeting. She could only manage a whisper. Your Grace. He extended a gloved hand. It was a gesture of command, not invitation. The first waltz. With me, time stopped. Ilara could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, could feel the shock rippling through the room like a physical force. She caught a glimpse of Serafina's face, her perfect smile frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief that quickly curdled into a cold, sharp fury. Her mother looked as if she might faint. For a heartbeat, Ilara considered refusing. The thought was wild, insane. It would be a scandal beyond measure. But the sheer perversity of the situation, the most sought-after man in London choosing the most invisible woman for the most visible of honors, was so staggering it felt like a dream. Perhaps she was asleep in her chair? But the Duke's hand remained, suspended in the air between them. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze held hers, and there was no escape. Slowly, as if moving through water, she placed her trembling fingers in his. His grip was firm, cool, and impersonal. He led her onto the dance floor, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea. The silence was deafening. Then, as he drew her into the formal hold of the waltz, the orchestra seemed to remember its purpose and surged back to life. He was a surprisingly adept dancer, guiding her with an effortless, mechanical precision. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed over her shoulder, his expression unchanged. Ilara kept her eyes on the starched white of his cravat, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure he must feel it. She had no idea what to say. The silence stretched, taut, and uncomfortable. What did one say to a block of handsome, grieving granite? She risked a glance at his face. His jaw was clenched, a muscle working rhythmically. He looked as though he were performing a distasteful but necessary duty, like signing a death warrant. Why? The question screamed in her mind. Why her? Was it a mistake? A deliberate slight to the other, more eager ladies? A bizarre, cruel joke? She could think of no logical reason. She was not beautiful, not witty, not wealthy. She was nothing. And yet, here she was, in the arms of the Duke of Blackwood, the center of a storm of speculation she could feel brewing at the edges of the dance floor. As the final notes of the waltz faded, he released her with the same impersonal swiftness with which he had taken her. He gave a stiff, formal bow. "My thanks, Lady Ilara," he said, his voice flat, and then he was gone, turning on his heel and striding from the ballroom without a backward glance, leaving her alone in the center of the floor, the target of every whisper, every stare, every envious and incredulous glare in London. The glittering room, which had always felt so distant, was now closing in, and Ilara felt a tremor of fear. The Duke of Blackwood had, for reasons she could not begin to fathom, just ruined her quiet, invisible life. The carriage ride home was a masterclass in frigid silence. Serafina sat opposite Ilara, her face a mask of cold fury, her fan tapping a sharp, angry rhythm against her palm. Their mother, Lady Ashworth, alternated between fanning her own flushed face and darting worried, confused glances at her two daughters. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. Ilara stared out at the gaslit streets of London, the familiar view feeling alien and threatening. The Duke's touch, impersonal as it was, seemed to linger on her glove, a phantom weight. When they finally reached the townhouse, Serafina swept past them without a word, the rustle of her silver silk gown sounding like a hiss. Lady Ashworth, however, cornered Ilara in the foyer. "Ilara, what is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice a strained whisper. "Have you had some prior acquaintance with the Duke? Some secret correspondence?" "No, Mamma, of course not," Ilara replied, her own voice barely audible. "I was as shocked as you." "It makes no sense," her mother fretted, pacing the worn Aubusson rug. "To overlook Serafina, to choose you for the first waltz. It is a statement, a deliberate one. But what is it saying?" Ilara had no answer. She felt like a pawn in a game whose rules she did not understand, moved by a player whose motives were entirely opaque. She retired to her room with a headache blooming behind her eyes. The image of the Duke's stormy, unreadable gaze burned into her mind. The next morning, a footman delivered a note on thick, cream-colored parchment, sealed with a severe black wax stamp bearing the Vance crest, a hawk in stoic profile. It was addressed not to Lord Ashworth, but to Ilara herself. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The message was brief, its handwriting as stark and angular as the man who had penned it. "Lady Ilara, I request the honor of a private audience with you and your father this afternoon at 2 o'clock. I have a matter of business to discuss." Blackwood. Business. The word was so cold, so transactional. Ilara's sense of dread deepened. She showed the note to her father, whose expression shifted from confusion to a dawning, incredulous hope. "Business," Lord Ashworth murmured, reading the note twice. "With the Duke of Blackwood." At precisely 2 o'clock, the Duke's carriage, a severe black affair pulled by two perfectly matched black stallions, drew up to their door. He was shown into their formal parlor, a room that tried its best to look grand but was betrayed by the threadbare patches on the settee and the faint water stain on the ceiling. The Duke seemed not to notice, or perhaps not to care. He stood by the cold hearth, dominating the room with his presence. He dispensed with pleasantries. "Lord Ashworth, Lady Alara." "Thank you for receiving me, Your Grace," her father began, his voice overly hearty with nerves. "To what do we owe this unexpected honor?" The Duke's gaze shifted to Alara. It was direct and unnervingly assessing, as if he were evaluating a horse for purchase. "I require a wife," he stated, the words dropping into the silence of the room like stones into a still pond. "I find myself in need of a duchess to manage my household and serve as a hostess when duty requires. I have no interest in the frivolities of a London courtship. I prefer a more direct approach." Lord Ashworth blinked. "A wife, Your Grace?" "Indeed." The Duke's eyes did not leave Ilara's. "Lady Alara, your conduct at the ball last night was notable. In a room full of artifice and ambition, you displayed a quiet dignity. You sought no attention. You engaged in no gossip. You were content in your own company. These are qualities I find practical." Alara felt a strange, hot blush creep up her neck. He was describing her social failings as if they were virtues. Her invisibility, her defining characteristic, was what had drawn his eye. "I wish to make you an offer of marriage," he continued, his tone as flat as if he were discussing the price of grain. The room fell utterly silent. Ilara's mind went blank. Her father looked as though he had been struck by lightning. My daughter?" Lord Ashworth stammered. "Yes." The Duke finally turned to him. "I am aware of your financial difficulties. They can be resolved. I will settle your debts and provide a generous allowance for this household. In return, I will have a duchess who understands the terms of our arrangement from the outset." He turned back to Alara, and his next words were delivered with a cold, surgical precision that chilled her to the bone. "This will be a marriage in name and title only, Lady Alara. I will provide you with a home, security, and a respected position in society. You will want for nothing material. In return, I expect you to manage Blackwood Manor with efficiency and decorum. We will maintain separate chambers, we will lead separate lives, I have no affection to offer, and I will require none from you. My only demand is your discretion and your agreement to these terms. Do you understand?" It was the coldest, most passionless proposal in the history of matrimony. It was not an offer of a life together, but a contract for services rendered. He was not seeking a partner, he was hiring a duchess. And in the same breath, he was offering to save her family from utter ruin. He was offering her a gilded cage, but for her father, her mother, even for Serafina, he was offering a lifeline. She looked at her father's face, at the warring emotions there, shock, humiliation, and the overwhelming desperate pull of relief. She thought of the creditors, of the shame of their decline. And she thought of herself, a woman with no prospects, no dowry, destined for a quiet life as a spinster aunt. The Duke was offering her a different kind of quiet life, one of immense privilege and profound loneliness. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability. She lifted her chin, meeting his unyielding gaze. "I understand the terms, Your Grace." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his eyes, so fleeting she might have imagined it. "And do you accept them?" Her own quiet dignity, the very quality he claimed to admire, rose to the surface. She would not be a weeping, grateful beneficiary. She would be his equal in this transaction. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady. The Duke of Blackwood gave a single sharp nod, as if a deal had just been struck. "Excellent. I will have my solicitors contact you tomorrow." With another perfunctory bow, he turned and left the room. The front door closed behind him with a sound of finality, like a vault being sealed. Ilara stood in the shabby parlor, the newly betrothed Duchess of Blackwood, feeling not a flutter of joy, but the cold, heavy weight of a chain being locked around her life. The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in a fog of unreality. The wedding had been a small, stark affair, conducted in a cold city church with only immediate family present. Serafina had attended, her face a thunderous portrait of resentment, while their parents had radiated a nervous, brittle relief. Alistair, her husband, a word that felt foreign and absurd on her tongue, had stood beside her, a figure of remote formality. He had spoken his vows in a low, clear monotone, and when he'd slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, his touch had been as cold as the metal itself. There was no celebration, no wedding breakfast. Immediately following the ceremony, she was escorted to his waiting carriage, her trunk already strapped to the back, and they began the long drive to his ancestral home in the north. For hours they sat in silence, the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves and the creak of the leather suspension the only sounds between them. Alistair stared out the window, his profile rigid, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. Ilara watched the rolling hills of the countryside slide past, the green landscape a blur through her unshed tears. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were a ghost being transported to her haunting grounds. The man beside her was a stranger, and the life that awaited her was a complete unknown. The terms of their arrangement echoed in her mind. Separate chambers, separate lives. I have no affection to offer. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, they turned off the main road, passing through a set of immense wrought-iron gates bearing the Vance Hawk. A long, winding drive, flanked by ancient brooding oak trees, led them deeper into the estate. The air grew cooler, scented with damp earth and moss. Then the manor itself came into view. It was not a house, it was a fortress, built of dark grey stone that seemed to absorb the fading light. Blackwood Manor rose from the landscape with a severe, imposing grandeur. Its lines were sharp and unforgiving, its many windows like vacant eyes staring out over the sprawling, untamed parkland. A sense of profound melancholy clung to the very stones, a silent, waiting stillness that felt centuries old. It was a perfect reflection of its master, powerful, beautiful in a harsh way, and utterly devoid of welcome. The carriage rolled to a stop on a gravel drive before a massive oak door. As if on cue, the door swung open and a line of servants filed out. Arranging themselves in a formal receiving line, they were led by a stern, slender woman with iron-grey hair pulled into a severe bun. Her black dress was immaculate, her posture ramrod straight. Alistair stepped out of the carriage and turned to help Ilara down, his hand performing the duty with the same impersonal courtesy as before. "Ilara, this is Mrs. Gable, my housekeeper," he said, his voice flat. "She will see to your needs." Mrs. Gable executed a crisp, shallow curtsy. "Your Grace," she said, her voice as starched as her collar. Her eyes, a pale, intelligent blue, flickered over Ilara, taking in every detail with a swift professional assessment. There was no warmth in her gaze, only a reserved watchfulness. "Mrs. Gable, Her Grace will be taking the Sunderland suite in the East Wing," Alistair instructed. The East Wing. As far as possible, Ilara surmised from his own chambers in the West. The physical manifestation of their agreement. "Very good, Your Grace," the housekeeper replied. Alistair then turned to Ilara. "I have business in my study. Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms. We will dine at 8. It was a dismissal. Without another word, he strode into the house, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor of the great hall, leaving her on the steps with the silent, staring staff. A young footman brought in her trunk, and Ilara followed Mrs. Gable into the cavernous entrance hall. The air inside was cold, carrying the faint scent of beeswax and something else, something like dust and disuse. A vast, sweeping staircase dominated the space, and dark, severe portraits of Vance's ancestors stared down from the walls, their expressions ranging from haughty to grim. The silence was immense, broken only by the whisper of their footsteps. They ascended the staircase and turned down a long, wide corridor. The East Wing, tapestries depicting grim hunting scenes hung on the walls, their colors fade.